Okay, so in this video I'll be covering cellular respiration, the basics behind energy exchange in the body and in plants. So basically, in our ecosystem, light comes in, light energy, then um, photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast, and that light energy is transferred into chemical energy in the form of organic molecules, and O2 is released. Those organic molecules in O2 go to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria produce ATP, release CO2 and H2O, and those materials go back to the chloroplast for photosynthesis. But um, ATP that powers most cellular work, and once it's used up, all the energy is lost as heat. So the breakdown of organic molecules is exergonic. That means it releases energy. It's going to happen by itself. You don't have to put in energy to break down those big molecules. There's really two types of ways that we make ATP in our bodies and in other organisms. There's aerobic respiration, which is the cellular respiration that we all learn about, the big one that produces a bunch of ATP. But there's also fermentation, which doesn't use oxygen and only produces some ATP. Okay, so for cellular respiration, although like a bunch of stuff can be broken down into its constituents and make ATP, we tend to use glucose for a general equation just to make things easy on ourselves so we don't have to memorize a bunch. So here's the general equation for cellular respiration. You probably don't have to worry about memorizing it, but just make sure you know what goes in and what goes out. Okay, so all the reactions that we're going to focus on in cellular respiration and photosynthesis are there going to be redox reactions. That means that one molecule loses an electron and another one gains an electron. I'm sure you don't need to know like the complexities behind this because this is not a chemistry class, but again, know that it's a transfer of electrons. Okay, so because I was talking about them being a redox reaction and there's a transfer of electrons in cellular respiration and photosynthesis, there's the electrons need to travel through the reaction in a vessel or like, and so they travel through NAD plus. So NAD plus is a compound and it has no extra electron, but then the electron can connect to it, make it become NADH, and it travels through the reaction as NADH, which means the electron's on there. Blah 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 blah. And again, NADH passes the passes through the electron transport chain. This is kind of important, not too much, but there's some reactions out there that release a bunch of energy all at once, and that would be of no use to us because we can't take in all that energy at one time. But in our body, energy is released little by little, and that produces energy that we can consume. So you just need to know that it's like baby steps for us, but like in the sun, it's like a big boom. Okay, so there's now we're getting to the actual cellular respiration stuff. There are four major steps in cellular respiration. There is glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. I'm gonna just give a quick overview of each of the steps, and then we'll go into a little more complex stuff. So glycolysis, the big sugar splits up into two little sugars. Some ATP is going to be released, and some electrons are going to go to the last step in the form of NADH. In those two little sugars are going to go to pyruvate oxidation. They're going to lose some electrons, and those electrons are going to go to the last step. Then they go to the citric acid cycle, where the sugars keep on breaking down, and they get really and the sugars go away. They're released as carbon dioxide, and that releases a bunch of um, electrons too, and some ATP is released. And in the last step, which I'll go into really big detail about, all the electrons that are used up, and a bunch of ATP is made. This is the step where like most of our ATP comes from. Now let's go into details. This is not useful. Okay. All the other steps that I mentioned are really like you just need to know what they are and what happens in them, but you don't need to know like what really happens in them. So I'm just gonna go over the most important step, which is the oxidative phosphorylation, like I explained, makes a bunch of ATP. So basically, you have a bunch of electrons from the other step, right? And so the electrons go through this, and um, that energy helps hydrogen ion, and the electrons have energy, right? So the hydrogen ions go through, use that energy to go against its electrochemical gradient. That means it's going from low to high instead of high to low, so it's going to go outside the membrane. Then in the last step, a bunch the hydrogens are going to go down its electrochemical gradient. That's going to release a bunch of energy, and ATP is going to be made because it's going to soak up that energy. Because ADP is going to soak up that energy and become ATP. ATP gets made by ATP synthase. You probably already know that. Very important thing to know, ATP synthase. And like I said, the electrons that power the hydrogen ions to do this, they're going to be released. They're going to combine with these two wonderful atoms, hydrogen and oxygen, and become water, and water is going to be released. And so know that step really well because that's where a lot of our ATP comes from. Um, you're gonna need, again, like, this produces a lot, that last step produces a lot of ATP, but sometimes we don't need it. So, um, like when animals hibernate, they don't need that much ATP. So there's like a special uncoupling protein that makes that reaction stop working, so they produce less ATP and use less of their food source. Okay, and this is going to be a test question on the test. So brown fat cells produce a protein called thermogenin in their mitochondrial inner membrane. Thermogenin is a channel for facilitated transport of protons across the membrane. What will occur in the brown fat cells when they produce thermogenin? Again, thermogenin is going to stop the last step from happening because you know how it's really the hydrogen ion goes outside and comes back inside. This is going to provide other exits for the hydrogen ions to go to, and the hydrogen ions are not going to want to come back in because all of them are want to go outside through these channels. So ATP synthesis will decrease, and because ATP synthesis decrease, all the energy from the other steps needs to go somewhere. So it's going to be released as heat, and heat generation is going to increase. So the answer to that question is C. Um, and again, I'm just going to go over fermentation really quick. So remembering glycolysis, a big sugar is going to be split into two. Basically, that happens and those two sugars are going to be converted into something else. And where you remember how that step produces some ATP, that's the only ATP made in this. So it only makes a fraction of the ATP as the whole cellular respiration, but this doesn't involve any oxygen. So that's fermentation.